I'm going to go ahead and introduce our keynote speakers today.
Woo!
Maria Hornbacher is an award-winning journalist, essayist, novelist, poet, and the New York Times bestselling author of 5 books, including one some of you might be familiar with, Wasted, a memoir of anorexia.
I don't think the mic's on.
She is a recipient of the Annie Dillard Award for Nonfiction, the Logan Fellowship for Social Justice Journalism, the White Award for Magazine Journalism, the ASCAP Award for Music Journalism, the Fountain House Humanitarian Award, and other distinctions as well. Her books have been translated into more than 30 languages, and she's published in a wide range of magazine journals that I'm not going to list off here. She's currently working on a multimedia project, a form of long-form journalism about gender, land, and the myth of movement in America. I think sounds quite interesting as well. Today, she's going to be presenting a talk for us titled Recovered Past Tense, How Eating Disorders End. And I told Maria I printed out a talk this morning, and I was so excited when I saw the first line, because I was like, that's something I've been thinking a lot about too. And I really also want to thank Maria for agreeing to participate. It's so kind.
Hey, y'all, wake up. Every now and then I'll have to teach a 2 o'clock class, and it's devastating. I'm sorry about the time, and I know nappy and everything like that. Chop, keep up. My name is Maria Hornbacher. I'm an author and a journalist and a teacher. I have been listening to all of the impressive CV and evidence of scholarship and everything like that. I'm actually trained as an ethicist and a philosopher of narrative. Beyond that, mostly I just think about narrative and do a lot with that. But I think a lot these days about the representation of self and other in the narratives that we tell each other and ourselves. So that may or may not pertain. One of the things that I heard somebody say today was we study what we define, and I'm struck by that. It's just been on my mind since then. Everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I'm real soft-spoken. As far as I'm aware, there's not a whole lot of conversation underway in either clinical or academic circles about how eating disorders end. I would offer the caveat here that I've spent the last 30 years steering well clear of this field. I do not work in or anywhere near it. I have no academic credentials relevant to it and no clinical expertise with it, and I am by no means up to speed on current eating disorder research. But I did at one time have an eating disorder, and now I don't. And since my own professional life gives me access to a lot of databases, and I know a lot of people much smarter than myself, I did a quick literature review, crunched some numbers, made a couple calls, and unfortunately, in this case, I am right. The one aspect of eating disorders that receives strikingly scant study, very little funding, and virtually no clinical consideration is recovery. Since recovery, and to a lesser extent prevention, are the presumed aim of any medical research, and would seem to be the logical goal of any medical treatment, I find the paucity of research and apparent dearth of knowledge about how to treat these illnesses specifically in a way that helps the people who have them heal somewhat surprising. Based simply on demographic data, there are more people who have recovered from eating disorders, whether or not they were formally diagnosed, whether or not they ever had access to or availed themselves of treatment, whether or not their recovery was helped or hindered by the treatment they may or may not have received, whatever measures they took to recover. There are far more people who had at one time disordered eating and no longer do than people who have been or could be clinically diagnosed at this time. Just as a practical matter, if one's goal is to effectively treat an illness, it seems much more reasonable to me to study people who have recovered than people who are still sick. Given the number of eating disorder experts who are genuinely interested in understanding the disorders better and treating them more effectively, and given the sizable population of people who have already recovered, I think it would make more sense for those experts to ask. Just ask recovered people how they recovered. Ask what they tried, what worked, what didn't, how long it took, what were the setbacks, what were the markers of progress. How did they know when they were a little better, and then a lot better, and when they felt they'd finally either gotten free of it or let it go, and when, as one eventually just does, they stopped thinking about it at all. How did these people put one foot in front of the other and just get well? I've been asked in my career as a public-ish person a lot of things. I've been asked my weight on national television. I've been asked my sexual preference on the BBC. I've been asked whether I thought some starlet who was behaving badly had this mental illness or that one, which I am in no way qualified to answer, by People magazine. I've been asked what brand and shade of lipstick I was wearing by the largest newspaper in the world, I've been asked whether writing my first book was therapeutic, which I very much doubt, but don't honestly remember because that was 3 marriages ago, when I was barely old enough to legally enter a bar, and it is now completely immaterial to my work in my life. I've been asked whether I take personal responsibility for the existence of online pro-eating disorder communities and for each and every eating disorder anyone has ever developed during their own engagement with those online communities because of a book I wrote about my own eating disorder before the internet existed. But I have never been asked by a person in a position to help sick people how I got well. But I did.
Great.
It turns out, contrary to everything I was told, contrary to popular knowledge and received wisdom, contrary to every diagnostic prediction and clinical prognosis and dire warning and funereal dirge, contrary to the reigning narrative that eating disorders are usually chronic out of the gate, I got well. And it wasn't impossible, and it wasn't a miracle, and treatment wasn't helpful, and was often harmful. And the treatment modalities that exist today are not substantively more effective than the treatment modalities that existed when I was strapped to a bed and force-fed as a punishment for being mouthy when I was 16. Despite the fact that people are constantly, quote, failing treatment and failing meds, despite the fact that an untold number of people have recovered without formal eating disorder treatment, and a large and vocal population of treatment survivors, by their own term, have recovered and continue to recover in spite of treatment, it turns out that eating disorders can and do end. I was given to believe that wasn't one of the options. I was assured by people who knew that recovery was theoretically possible, but very unlikely for me. I was told that people like me didn't get well. That was completely and abjectly untrue. I was no more uniquely sick than anyone else who is sick, no more uniquely capable of recovery than anyone else who gets well. But the presumptive chronicity of these illnesses, presumptive chronicity of the illnesses with which I was diagnosed before I was old enough to vote, brought with them more than just the names for the constellations of symptoms that I had. Interestingly, though, neither diagnosis nor treatment provided either a coherent strategy for how my disordered eating might be helped, or even resolved, and none brought a reason to believe that it could be. Treatment, diagnosis, neither offered any substantial support in identifying what was right about me, but did place an almost granular level of focus on what was wrong, did not help me seek out my own values, set meaningful goals, tap into my strengths, or allow me to think for even an instant that I had the option of just stopping it, resetting my course, and finishing the 10th grade with everyone else. Instead, upon diagnosis, I was shuffled off into the revolving door of what we benignly call the system, joining a largely docile herd of bodies, mostly young, mostly white, mostly assigned female at birth, that shuffled from hospital to treatment center to long-term care facility and back again around and around, with no apparent means of exiting the loop other than to die, and I watched people die, or to become so compliant that by some magic, a weight could be achieved, at which point they would be released back into the wild, about as prepared to handle the vagaries of life and the mystery of grocery stores and the onslaught of real-world information as a bottle-fed baby bird. Once my body, my social security number and name were entered into this system, I was assigned a room number, a hospital bed, a calorie count, a goal weight, and a clinical profile that had nothing whatsoever to do with me. I was no longer an awkward kid with a big mouth, but a patient. My life and mind and body now in the care and under the control of strangers who, for reasons that remained and in fact remain obscure, were running my life. These people gave me short, terse, mildly concerned lectures on my prognosis, poor, and the risks posed by my condition, very grave, as well as a quick summary of what I could expect, not from treatment, not on my way to recovery, but from the rest of my life, as I shuffled laps into and out of professional care. The assumption of chronicity was immediate. It was a priori. It was given. There was no time to consider other possible outcomes. These people were very busy. There were no ways out. I was wrapped in a paper gown, divested of my shoes, put on a scale, and told, as the good doctor sent me off to snack, that I would probably struggle with this to some extent for the rest of my life. That has not been my experience. What I'd like to say is that my experience is dated and reflects the ignorance of the olden days. I'd like to say it's one of those now embarrassing medical and scientific misperceptions that time thankfully reveals when science and medicine do, as they do, advance. I wish the baseline presumption of chronicity now seemed quaint. I'd like us to roll our eyes at the idea that a non-organic behavioral syndrome that we call an illness is not in fact a chronic illness. How silly. Of course, the earth is not flat. And if treatment had fundamentally changed in the past 30 years, beyond becoming exponentially more profitable, if there was any evidence of a causal relationship between the burgeoning treatment industry and an increase in positive treatment outcomes. If I'd written a book when I was 22 years old about what even then was much more clearly a systemic cultural phenomenon than a scientifically coherent disease, and that book were now irrelevant, as I intended it to be, because of a deeper understanding of eating disorders that naturally would have led by now to significant advances both in the field and in the culture. If all, or in fact any, of that had taken place, I would feel that we had come a long way, but I do not, because in fact we have not. The last time I gave a talk publicly on eating disorders, which was well over a decade ago, I was speaking to a group of clinicians on a very hot day in a freezing cold Las Vegas conference hotel. In my remarks, I floated an idea that seemed pretty straightforward to me. I said that clinicians would do well to focus less on what was wrong with their clients and more on helping those clients identify their values and strengths. Instead of endlessly examining the ways in which clients were sick, they might help clients tap into their own desire and capacity to recover. A very slight perceptual shift, I said, away from passivity and toward agency might allow clients to see solutions were well within reach. It would allow them to feel that they were no longer hopeless, experience themselves no longer as helpless in the face of what often feels and is represented as a powerful external force, that they actually held all the power. Such an approach, I said, would be empowering. And since eating disorders are tightly bound up with issues of power, agency, free will, autonomy, and control, a direct effort to aid clients in identifying, owning, and developing their own sense of autonomy and self-determination would help them design and create a sustainable, recovered life. A life, as we say in recovery circles, where you don't need an eating disorder because you don't have to escape. What I was saying that morning didn't strike me as particularly controversial. I took as given that people in the helping professions would in fact want to help, that their goal in providing care for people who are suffering would be to help those people suffer less. I wrapped up my remarks and we went to Q&A. One of the attending clinicians raised her hand. She was visibly angry. She asked me, "So are you implying that eating disorders are a choice?" I thanked her for the question and said, "No, I'm not implying that. I am, however, explicitly stating that recovery is a choice." She stood up, gathered her things, and walked out. So I'll say it again. Recovery is a choice. That era in cultural time, and eating disorders are, like everything else, embedded in cultural time, even created by it, and can only be understood within the perceptual context of that moment in cultural time. That moment was greatly concerned with triggers. Triggers are real, triggers are also vague. The word trigger is kind of a trigger, as overdetermined, overused, and connotatively loaded as it has become. But that cultural moment, the early 20-teens, was marked by what many people my age and older saw as perhaps an ill-considered desire to protect people from anything that might interrupt their comfort in the experience of being a thinking person in the world. The intention, like most intentions, was good. The effect, not nearly so much. Around the Western world, a rallying cry against triggers rang out. Books and articles, music and theater and visual art, broadcast news and print journalism and online blogs. Advertisements, billboard, chat rooms, magazines, these things were dangerous. Images were dangerous, language dangerous, ideas were dangerous, dissent and debate dangerous. Everything needed to come with a warning. While noisy, the campaign to protect us all from triggers was a largely academic exercise, just as the life's work of anti-porn activists has really come to naught. The effort to protect everyone from everything wasn't effective because internet. More problematic for my tastes was the underlying assumption that drove this whole campaign, which seemed to hinge on the paternalistic belief that adults lack the capacity for discernment and critical thought, that they lack, in fact, the intelligence to decide for themselves what they will do with the information they encounter, the work they consume, and the experiences that they have. They lack the authority over themselves to determine how they wish to navigate the world and whatever it, in its infinite entropy, throws their way, and therefore are absolved also of responsibility for the consequences of their own response. While this effort was persistently framed as a desire to protect people from harm, since it is not possible to protect the whole unruly mass of individual human beings just wandering around willy-nilly with their subjectivities hanging out and free will flapping in the wind, the underpinnings of the effort to protect us all from the general unpleasantness revealed themselves to be largely paternalistic. If I presume to know better than someone else what poses a risk to someone else and what does not, what they can and can't handle, how I should best manage their experience for them, I strip them of the power to make their own decisions and claim that control for myself. By calling what I do an effort to help, I redeem myself and infantilize them, insult their intelligence, pathologize their perception, assume their incompetence, and by controlling the information to which they have access, strip them of their right to and capacity for informed, independent choice. So about the time I gave the talk I just was talking about, the spirit of genteel, beneficent control was everywhere. And had it been just another weird lurch in the social discourse and general mood, I wouldn't have been that concerned. What did concern me was the possibility that the spirit, which was already a shaping force in the industries built up around mental health care, would further corrode the validity of psychiatric and psychological frameworks and their ability to provide meaningful assistance to people who were, in greater and greater numbers, seeking guidance and care from those industries, based on the belief that the guidance they received would lead out of crisis, out of addiction, out of disorder, out of emotional pain, out of mental distress. I worried that this strangely reductive, fundamentally essentialist belief, which held that reasonable adults could not be trusted to make their own choices about how to survive an encounter with mainstream reading material, could, if taken to its logical conclusion, render a large and disproportionately influential profession, one that has always walked a very fine line between care and social control, more powerful than ever. As time marched on, the anarchic-leaning turn of the century fell out of favor. Social mores that had informed my own sense of power over and responsibility for my own happiness, my own actions, and my own mental health. Those very socio-cultural values that helped me believe that I could and had to recover. Those gave way to a brave new world in which a multi-billion-dollar psychiatric industry began a profitable and public collaboration with a multi-trillion-dollar pharmaceutical industry in generating not new science but new spin, not more precise treatments but more all-inclusive illnesses, the symptoms of which, though certainly vague, might, any one of them who knew, benefit 1 or 2 or 6 or 12 of the repackaged, remarketed, renamed, branded, not yet available in generic, but if you stay on them for 17 years, they'll probably be cheaper meds that just happen to be sitting on any given psychiatrist, forgive me, desk after the pharmaceutical rep stopped by. It was a remarkable time. The largely unexamined, unchecked emotional reactivity of a cultural moment captured the popular imagination. A feverish desire to protect the fragile psyches of more or less functional adults swept through media outlets. The desire to protect the feelings and thoughts of inherently vulnerable others gave way naturally to the internalized conviction that each of us, too, is inherently and constantly vulnerable, and also entitled to protection from psychic discomfort, lest there be a moment's interruption in the seamlessly enjoyable experience of living in the world and being conscious a lot of the time. Slowly, the pendulum swung from the era, also flawed, of tough love and suck it up and deal with it, to an era in which an eating disorder clinician, whose job was explicitly to help people with eating disorders, attended a lecture on eating disorders by someone who had had a serious eating disorder and recovered. And when the speaker articulated the core fact of her experience in recovery, that eating disorder recovery involves making a choice, the clinician, rather than sticking around to hear anything further about how agency, empowerment, self-determination, and choice had saved that woman's life, walked out. The clinician's response speaks volumes even now. It speaks to the widespread belief or fear that if choice is a factor in eating disorder recovery, it must also be a factor in etiology. The logical fallacy goes like this. If I can choose to recover, and I did, then I must equally have chosen to get sick post hoc, ergo propter hoc. Logical fallacies like those are everywhere evident in the foundations of the field. The exact nature of the fallacies and assumptions changes somewhat every few years, but the nature of logical fallacy, the inherent fallacy of it, is that it rests on assumptions that have not been proven true, may not even have been tested, and in many cases can readily be proven false. An acceptance of the framework into which we cram the unwieldy, amorphous, and totally dynamic phenomena of eating disorders requires us to accept as given a great many baseline assumptions that we should not accept. Assumptions for which there is little to no evidence beyond the received wisdom of professionals who may or may not have updated their data sets in decades, and who are themselves anyway dependent for that data on research conducted by other experts who have yet to substantially study people who have recovered from an illness they study and treat. Eating disorders are not chronic by definition. People themselves are not chronic and do not have to live as if the course of their lives traces a predestined purgatorial loop. We are all aware of the fact that eating disorders have an improbably high mortality rate, the highest of any psychiatric disorder. What we hear far less often is the fact that the majority of people who have at some point in their lives engaged in disordered eating or even had clinically diagnosed eating disorders eventually get well. I stress this not to undercut the seriousness of the risk that eating disorders present to both individual and public health, but to establish that eating disorder recovery is not rare. It is not impossible to achieve. It is not even hard to understand. It is just ignored because the clinical focus is fixed on the diagnosis and palliative mitigation of serious disorder. Research is fixed on identifying etiology, and no one has time or money to bother themselves with people who are already well. From a crisis management standpoint, it makes sense. It makes sense in the way all American medicine and medical research makes sense, and that it makes no practical sense. It makes no sense for patients or families. It makes no sense in terms of prevention or recovery-oriented care. It makes sense as a business model. It does not make sense in terms of creating sustainable strategies for long-term individual or public health. The chronicity model remains popular for a lot of reasons, very few of which are scientifically valid and none of which really have an ethical defense. The belief that eating disorders are fundamentally untreatable ensures that treatment can't work, and it doesn't. This creates an endlessly self-replicating supply of patients. This is, of course, an extraordinarily effective business strategy, one employed, oh, you guys are gonna take me out of here on a pole, most famously by the tobacco industries, in their deliberate targeting of young people to create, as their internal memoranda later proved, replacement smokers for the existing smokers their products would eventually kill. An eating disorder doesn't exist independent of the individual who has it. No one has ever caught an eating disorder. No eating disorder has ever existed without the active participation of the individual in whom it exists. And just as an eating disorder is not an outside force, there is no outside force that can provide cure. No matter how skilled and well-intentioned professionals in the field may be, the sole task of treatment providers is or ought to be to support clients as they find their own way to what means health in their lives. When we view individual experience through the narrow and often warped lens that seeks pathology, pathology can be found. Diagnosis then becomes little more sometimes than a matter of tallying up an individual's maladaptive behaviors and seeing whether these behaviors tick more boxes in this category of disorder or that. We're all familiar with the fact that the taxonomical approach to subjective human experience and the amorphous morass of the phenomena of consciousness is reductive and in almost every regard flawed. But the desire to understand etiology, which we much more bluntly and simplistically are discussing when we discuss what causes eating disorders and who or what is at fault, is not an end in itself. It presupposes a belief that if we understand what causes them, we can better understand what will bring about their end. Neuroscientists have been for decades, still consumed by the same probably fantastical quest for a mechanism, a thing that causes definitively mental illness. Mental illness, of course, has no agreed upon definition, no agreed upon course, no agreed upon prognosis, virtually no biomarkers to this day. Very few tests that can be given or taken to determine which mental illness, if any, an individual person actually has, but science persists in its quest to locate and clearly define the causal factor or factors in the development of illnesses for which no clear definition has in fact been reached. They want to know what causes mental distress. If they know what causes it, presumably they can nip distress in the bud, catch the problem early, head it all off the pass. It is a noble cause. Of course, we all want our work to benefit someone, not harm them, to have beneficial effect in their lives. But in fact, what happens when the medical model is superimposed upon a human being is that the human being begins to recede into an infinite regress of clinical assumptions, incomplete and decontextualized data and diagnostic codes. The effect is dehumanizing. Clinicians no longer see a person, but a patient. And the person on whom that clinical gaze is trained is never unaware of how narrow their selfhood has become. An understanding of etiology, of the things that cause or at least create a vulnerability to eating disorders in any one person is useful only if it does serve some greater end, a practical end, an actionable, attainable end for an illness where full recovery is absolutely an option. There is neither a medical nor an ethical justification for limiting treatment or research to the narrow question of what is wrong with one person, what is one person doing wrong. If that's the only question asked, it's the wrong question. There is no single right question, but there are better questions. Not to provide a clearer clinical picture for the professional team, but for the individual seeking recovery to answer. That individual does not owe professionals compliance, agreeability, the willingness to be a grateful or at least a passive receptacle for care. She owes herself a chance at life. She gives herself that chance sometimes by realizing that she, not they, is the one who knows how she got there, why it started, how it got so bad. She is the one who can put those pieces together and walk out. People recover from eating disorders when they no longer serve a meaningful purpose for their lives, when they have a better way of coping, when they have the tools that they need and they know how to use them. The only valid function of eating disorder treatment is to help people become medically stable enough to figure out what their purpose is, to find those other ways of coping, to acquire more effective tools and start banging around until they figure out what they've got. Soon enough, they get pretty good at using the tools, and eventually, they don't even have to think about which one they grab. They just reach for the one that works best for the task at hand, and they use it. Did I choose or even intend to get sick? Or did I reach for whatever tools I could find to address what felt broken to me as a very small girl? Did those tools, however blunt and inefficient they may have been, work to some extent for some period of time? Did they serve some purpose? If they did, if the tools I had at hand were in some way capable of taking hold of me to an equal or greater extent than I took hold of them, if something about those tools lent themselves to repetitive use, if they had some pull of their own that could be called compulsive or addictive, if the tools I was using gained mastery over me before my brain was even developed enough to gain mastery over them, then the element of intention and choice is much more complex. Just as the book I wrote when I was 22 years old is not the book that I would write at 49. The choice that I made as a 9-year-old girl to make myself throw up is not the choice I'd make 4 decades later. Did I choose to get sick? No, I was 9. Did someone else make me sick? Absolutely not. I hope at this point in the evolution of all of our fields, we've moved beyond the invention of scapegoats and blaming suffocating mothers and cold unavailable fathers for the problem child that all of us actually are. Perhaps it no longer even needs to be remarked that families are, by definition, dysfunctional. Nearly a century and a half ago, Leo Tolstoy began Anna Karenina with the observation, happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. My family did not make me sick. It was just unhappy in its own peculiar way, the same as yours. Did culture make me get sick? Not yes. The culture that informs and inflects and infects my life and self-perception to this day is the self-same Western culture that has given rise to a pantheon of minor gods, which serve as the repository of collective longing, fear, and desire. These emotionally charged icons and the visual iconography by which they are imprinted on our minds shifts only very slightly from one generation to the next. The sainted ascetic becomes the frail consumptive. The divine madman becomes the self-destructive writer, too wise for this world. James Dean becomes Kurt Cobain. The tortured soul becomes the train wreck girl. At different points in our lives, we cycle through a whole host of psychic personae, aspects of identity and social roles. The archetypal has much more pull on us than I think we are aware. There is no single cause, no bad guy, no easy evil outside force. Social media doesn't cause eating disorders in this generation any more than my book caused eating disorders in the last. Any more than 17 magazine caused it in my generation, any more than Twiggy caused it before that, any more than Betty Page caused it during the war, or flappers and suffragists caused it before that. Eating disorders are a cultural malaise. The malaise is deeper than media, or the generationally contingent means by which people get the idea to engage in disordered eating practices. No one needs instructions on how to get or sustain an eating disorder. No one factor causes people to develop disordered eating practices. There is no one-to-one mechanism of causality. Be that the mythological eating disorder gene, or the idea that I got my eating disorder from an after-school special I watched on TV. This generation, like everyone before it, has people who will trip and fall into the rabbit holes that exist almost accidentally without knowing how or why, for no reason other than that they were in the right place at the wrong time. It also has people who are suffering deeply for all kinds of reasons and who will go looking for a place safer than their own lives and bodies and minds, who will seek refuge from that suffering wherever it can be found. And in that search, they will find these disorders and others, and some of them will become terribly ill and some of them will die. But most of them will heal. and I actually believe virtually all of them could. Almost every letter I've ever received from someone with an eating disorder includes the sentence, usually near the top, "I know I will always deal with this to some extent." It's the same language every time. Every time I read it, I'll tell you I feel my inner child fling herself to the floor and sob. I've received thousands of letters and emails and posts and messages from people who describe what they are doing to recover, describe their work, their effort, their confusion, their successes and failures, their frustration, their joy. They describe recovery. They describe recovery fought for, lost, thrown away, recovered, regained, restored. They describe being recovered, having recovered, past tense. And still there is this chant that has been drummed into their heads, our heads, my head. This sing-song chant, "I know that I will always deal with this to some extent," looping over and over in our minds. We heard it so many times, we began to say it to each other, began to say it to ourselves. Even as we fought to get better, even as we fought to get out, we said it so that they would understand and believe that we were better, that we were ready to be out, to be released back into the wild and spread our wide or small or broken or strong or lopsided wings and just go. And here we are, winging along, years and sometimes decades later, and I can still taste the Ensure, still smell the smell of hospital eggs. I can still feel the tubes going down the back of my throat, hear the incessant crinkle of the narrow hospital bed, and there in the back of my mind, it's still going. I will always deal with this to some extent. We recited it like the Pledge of Allegiance, whether we believed it or not, and I believed it for a long time, and then one day I realized that I did not. There are millions of people like me, millions of people who have recovered, and the only reason we still remember is that we can't forget. We remember the illness on and in our bodies. It is imprinted on the inside of our skulls. We fought to get out and we got out. We won't forget how bad it got. We won't forget how we got better. We got well. No one as yet is asking us how. I do not deal with eating disorders to any extent. I do not think about eating disorders unless I'm directly asked to talk about them, because I don't have one. And the cause and the nature and the name and the treatment of illness does not interest me. That is not the question I began to ask. That unfolded outward into other questions that reminded me what mattered, reminded me who I was and why I was alive, and made me want to live more fully, and ultimately led me back to reality and then onward into the building of a better life that I have never once wanted to escape. I have to apologize for the title of the talk. It was a trick. I can't tell you, broadly speaking, clinically speaking, how eating disorders end. That's the problem with subjectivity. I can tell you that they end. I can tell you that when they end, it is at least in part because someone made a fundamental choice to figure out for themselves how to end it for themselves. I made that choice again and again until it was easy, until it was as easy as breathing, and I didn't have to think about it anymore at all. I could tell you the millions of tiny choices, the countless incremental, infinitesimal changes, the slight adjustments and course corrections and missteps and mistakes that I made, but that would take me years. And anyway, the list would only tell you what worked for me. Another recovered person would tell you something entirely different. This will sound very unclinical, because while eating disorders are clinical, recovery is not. Eating disorders arise from the fact that being a human being is really hard, and very few of us come equipped with the instructions or the tools. Eating disorders end when we come to terms with the fact that we are flawed and messy and imperfect and embodied. We come to terms with that, and we come to terms with the fact that the person we are will survive it by any means necessary, and then finally we are free to live. Louder these days than the same old chant of helplessness and perpetual illness that does still echo in my head are the last few lines of a poem by Denise Levertov entitled Stepping Westward. The poem ends like this. If I bear burdens, they begin to be remembered as gifts, goods, a basket of bread that hurts my shoulders but closes me in fragrance. I can eat as I go. Thank you. toll, so I can't do that much damage. And I'm happy to take questions if anybody wants to just shout out. Yes?
Three things. First, on behalf of the psychiatric community, I'm sorry for the maltreatment that you experienced. It's horrible. I want to acknowledge that.
This has never happened in my entire career. Wow, but also no one has ever said that to me.
Thank you for sharing. I'm impressed with your willingness to give voice to all the feelings, which I wonder, out of my own experience of suppressing feelings with my own eating, disordered eating, that you're able to share these feelings with us, to me, signifies an important part of the company. There is one area which I don't agree with you.
Good.
I totally agree with you that I believe I did not choose my disordered eating. I also believe that recovery for me has been a choice. It's a choice that I continue to practice. I do consider myself suffering from a chronic progressive and relapsing disease, and that does not burden me. It's that basket of bread that I carry.
Yeah.
It's with me. And if I'm not practicing my disordered eating in my relationship with food, I'm certainly capable of practicing it in relation to my work. And the question was raised, what am I doing here on a Saturday? And part of me needs to be mindful. Is this part of my work addiction? Or is this part of an opportunity for me to carry a message of recovery, which is what I experience you do? And for me, the process of recovery and how I benefit from seeing myself as suffering from a chronic progressive relapsing disease, which I practice recovery for one day at a time. Part of how I do that is by carrying the message and joining you in that today.
Thank you so much.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So, just because I know you and we've kind of talked about it a little
Hello,
bit.
sweetheart.
So you mentioned earlier that when you were in the institutions that they were mainly white women. So can you just share with me like some commentary on why you believe that it exists more with white people than, I can only speak for my culture, which is African American. I'm African American, everyone. Because where I grew up, the eating disorders did not exist. You know, we didn't even really, the first time I ever heard about an eating disorder, I was in health class and my teacher was white. And everyone in my class was like, well, what is an eating disorder? In our house, we eat. You know what I mean? But we also have tragic, because you also talk about society and how eating disorders are external, right? And so because of the history of our lived trauma, I'm just wondering why, maybe your thoughts on why that isn't something that we externally turn to as opposed to the white people.
We were talking last night about the issue of scarcity, right? The issue of scarcity, you grew up with one kind, I grew up with a different kind, right? And I think that whatever, I think about eating disorders very little, and I think much more broadly about the ways in which fear and grief manifest in our contemporary lives. Historical trauma, past trauma, personal trauma. Those things continue to come out sideways sometimes, right? And as the gentleman was saying, if I am not, I have to be much more vigilant about my drinking. I have not had a drink in many decades, and yet that's something I perceive as a real right back there. I'm aware of this, I don't touch that, I don't go near it. And other people perceive their risk factor elsewhere, but I do think that the impulse to express grief destructively, often self-destructively, manifests differently in different communities, based very much on what they had and did not have in their families and homes and early lives. Mm-hmm. I think it's very easy for this sounds judgmental, but I grew up with enough food in my house. I had the option of not eating it, right? Mm-hmm. There are a lot of communities that don't have that option. I had that option. And had I grown up in a different community, I suspect grief and rage and cultural and personal trauma would have expressed themselves differently depending on that. That said, I mean, eating disorders are wildly underdiagnosed in communities of color. That's a lot of the problem, isn't that they aren't there, but they're not seen. And they aren't seen because standards, medical and visual, right, are coming from an assumption of whiteness, not an assumption of embodiment, not an assumption of grief or psychology or really anything. They're coming from an assumption of whiteness. Like even the BMI. None of this is based on a diverse body of research. And so I think there are a lot of different aspects of, I don't think it's that eating disorders don't exist in communities of color. I know that they do. I know that they are underdiagnosed. I know that people die of them because they are not receiving any form of care. Not just, formal treatment, but any form of care. And it goes under the wire. We know people who are ill because of what I would call an eating disorder, right?
But when we also think of eating disorders, we also think of eating disorders as someone who is very thin.
No,
But
we don't.
well, at least where I come from,
right.
you know what I'm saying? But the other thing about it is from what I said, what I experienced is overeating, and the acknowledgement of like that is an eating disorder too,
Yeah.
because what has been so sensationalized because that is the white standard
Exactly.
is thinness.
Right.
So I think that also affects the communities of colors as well in the idea that being obese or that is also, that can be an eating disorder.
Of course, absolutely.
So-
And I think, the sensationalized aspect of the anorexic, the fetishized aspect of the anorexic body has a great deal to do also with the sexualization and eroticization of illness in women and frailty and just this insane rampant desire to weaken oneself, to make oneself palatable, manageable, not take up too much space, all of these things that I think of the E. Cummings line, the power of your intense fragility. Do you know how I love that line in the 5th grade? And now it makes me want to puke, not to, sorry, tacky, I haven't done that in a long time either. But really, the power of my intense fragility, I can kick your ass. It really irritates me that I was so excited about that line as a 10-year-old. But so whatever the narratives, the literatures, the art that our communities invest meaning and power in, right? You grew up with different kinds of superwomen than I did, right? And so those bodies in many ways are invested with the metaphorical power of what we want.
Yeah.
So I think it's a lot more complex than just that looks like an eating disorder, that doesn't, it's a lot deeper than that and has a lot more to do with grief. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to also just make a comment, I guess, and maybe a question. Which I thought was really interesting, this theme of choice, which is something that I think about, my sort of vague title of my book, whatever, made it up, but I've been calling it Pathologies of Democracy. And sometimes people are like, why do you call it democracy? And I don't have a great expression to say it's about choice. And I'm very interested in whether these words have been linked with issues of choice.
Yes.
And I mean, in some ways this ties to what you were just talking about, but one of the ways that people have tended to do that is to say, first of all, eating disorders emerge in a situation where people have the choice to choose not to eat, which is already a very interesting statement, and actually really needs to be unpacked. What does that mean, right? But so this, and then there's this kind of linked idea that we have all today that modern society and the modern food system is an excess of choice.
Yes.
And that and people become pathologized through that choice, right?
Yeah.
And then I've got this trio of bodies, the anorexic, the bulimic, and the overeater, all as mentally ill people who've made 3 radically different choices, which leaves sort of no other choice left.
Right.
To deal with the overwhelming choice of the food system.
Yeah.
And so, but so I've been sort of thinking about choice as this category in terms of, I guess, treatment and diagnosis.
Yeah.
But I hadn't thought of it in terms of recovery. I mean, I know this issue comes up a lot in addiction, kind of addiction, right? But I hadn't thought about it specifically in terms of recovery. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about choice as an issue beyond the choice to recover, between.
Yeah, I mean, there's, as the gentleman said, the continuing choice to stay the course of recovery. It is very easy. It is remitting, relapsing, at least for a very long time, right? I think that, there are elements of choice by which, how shall I say this? I believe that we have the choice to look at these a bit more broadly and a bit less granularly, and it would improve our capacity to perceive individual clients, I'm not anybody's, provider, so individual people as what is this doing for you? What do you need from this? You know what I mean? I think if someone, this would not have been a salvation either, but if somebody had said, so what do you need to do? And at some level I might have said, I really need you to just let me run around constantly. I just need you to let me run in the yard like a shepherd, like a German shepherd, like just let me run loops, read books, and be left to my own devices, and I'll grow up and be all right. I would not have known that, but like the choices available to us in our lives are constrained and constricted by our idea of what ought to happen. To this day, people are like, Mario, when are you going to settle down? I'm like, not anytime soon, probably. You know what I mean? We're really behind in that arc. And there's this idea of like, this is the path, this is the narrative. That too, I would point out, is a white-moneyed narrative. It is a white-moneyed, educated narrative. And this is what it's supposed to, my CV says that I went off and played chess for 5 years. And then I wrote some books. And then I got tenure. How did that happen? None of that makes sense. But I had choices, mostly because I took hits. And I only knew that I could do that because I was screwing everything up. And then I went, oh, it's better over here. And the idea of choice to me more broadly, I believe that eating disorders and other addictions often emerge not in any way only, but in part in response to a feeling of being constrained, in response to a feeling of being trapped. I'm removing my needs from this system. I will no longer need you or food or anything. I reject the entire premise of the operation. And that in some way, am I philosophically in that position at 12? No. But was that a sustaining, am I still working with what I believe to be a fundamentally ascetic impulse in myself, which is to see how far can I go, right? I can bench your weight. I can bench their weight. Now I know how far I can go in that direction. I don't need to go the other directions to see how far down I can go, how sick I can get, how little I can need, because I have other choices. But if I'm told, what you are is ill, you are ill in this way, this is the name of your illness, this is the subtype of your named illness, for a moment, maybe that gives me a sense of power. Like, oh, thank God there's a name. Well, that's a Hegelian impulse, right? Like, I want to master this, so I've named it. I've named it Frank. This is my pet eating disorder. When people talk about, students talk about, my anxiety is really acting up. I'm like, you make it sound like a lapdog. You're like, what is this thing you're cultivating and curating over here to give yourself a sense of this is why being in a totally chaotic world hurts? Well, it hurts because it's painful, and it hurts because we're human beings. And so, like, choices. Hilda Brooke wrote about, a chaos of choices that women were facing in the 70s. Too many choices, too many options. Now that women have opportunities, there's too many choices. Well, that was an idea. I don't think she was necessarily not onto something, but, now we have choices, and we are constrained in new ways. And I feel that we impose constraints on ourselves in the same way that I will impose a formal structure on a poem I'm drafting to see what it'll do by pushing at the edges. Human beings do that. Children do that. People I'm here to tell you, juvie do that. People in treatment push edges just to be like, how safe am I? And how constrained. I feel like choice is a much broader question than it is a clinical matter. I've gone off in my own field now, so thank you for allowing me to indulge my interests. I should probably, I've got a couple, 2 minutes. Does anybody have a last question? 3 minutes, 4 minutes? Anybody? Yes, ma'am?
I'm very impressed by your discussion of recovery, because I think emotional recovery is something that we don't talk much about.
Yeah.
And there's this, so I'm just going to share something about how you lived through trauma as a child, and it's very similar to what you're saying, is that that the trauma, as you seek treatment for it, it's supposed to follow you. It's supposed to come back in all sorts of different ways.
Yes.
And then I've been trying to explain to people who are close to me why that trauma, all of a sudden, I hit a certain age, it went away.
Right.
I'm not angry, I'm not upset. It's just, I remember it.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting to me that we don't have a way of talking about the existence of trauma.
Healing.
And then it's not that, I've come over, I didn't work on it. I wasn't actively working on it.
Right.
It felt like, oh, it went away.
Right.
I resolved something.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But I just find, and I hear what you're saying about recovery, and I don't know if it's always real, but I feel like there's a lack of a social category
Yes.
of talking about
I agree, and I think, if we're gonna get into taxonomies and languages and codes and diagnostic rubrics, then can we have one where we ask people, what you're describing? Sometimes it's just lifted. Most of my treatment has taken place on a meditation cushion. A great deal of it has taken place hiking up mountains. A lot of my recovery has taken place lying on the floor thinking about something I was gonna write, right? Like, and sometimes you just sit up and you're like, I'm not even remotely angry at my mother anymore. Not even a little. Like, my mother's the most brilliant person I've ever known. Why would I be mad at her? Well, was she shitty? Yeah, but look, did you see what I did? Right, like at some point also there's just growing up. The best thing that's ever happened to me was menopause. Like, I was struck sane all of a sudden. Like, nobody tells you that when you're 14. Just hang on for 40 years and you'll be fine. And one day you'll wake up and be like, what was all that about? Like, what was that even about? And none of that comes in the instructions about you are traumatized, this will be awful, you will weep. Well, yeah, and then I did a bunch of EMDR therapy and went hiking for 5 years. And then I was okay pretty much. It wasn't like it was a clean arc. It wasn't like it was fast. How do we describe that? What is our language for that process of allowing healing to take place, right? If we leave the body the hell alone and do